Speaker, and it's a privilege to be speaking in the third reading of this bill. And it's a comfort to me to have just heard the speech by my parliamentary colleague Charles Chauvel, which perhaps is a development from the speeches that we heard during the period of the last debate on this particular bill in the committee stages. Just one point, if I may, to reflect on one of his points that he's just made, and that was the criticism of the SOP. Basically, it sets out very clearly the treaty clause in each of the environmental acts and sets out how they're to be treated. If that's a major problem, then I'm quite comforted that that's as bad as it gets. Because, Mr. Speaker, the establishment of the EPA changes the regulator, not the regulations. This is something that we've emphasised from the very beginning throughout the discussions with the submitters at the Select Committee. And from that point of view, it's actually a technical bill. It's a technical bill. It doesn't seek to change the regulations, it changes the regulator. And this is a significant point, I think, in allaying the concerns that have very properly been brought up by the opposition in their consideration of this bill. And it has been difficult to achieve the sort of consideration which I think makes for really good legislation, and have had the pleasure of that experience in the past with environmental changes. But with changes to the Select Committee membership, it was hard to have a consistent, discursive approach. I think the opposition, from my reading of it, based the minority report on the written submissions received by the committee. This is because of other obligations, other select committees, some of the key people were not able to give that cohesive attendance at the select committee. So we didn't have the sort of discussion that we're used to on environmental issues. And this is not a criticism. We understand what it's like in opposition heading towards an election. It's very difficult. And I'm comforted that the team from particularly Labour has seen fit to make very complimentary comments about the work of the committee with this bill, and I thank them for that, because there has been a lot of work done. I'm comforted too that the opposition seems more settled with the bill now, and I look forward to the sorts, and certainly more settled in its presence at select committees, and I look forward to the sorts of debates, discussions, disagreements, resolutions, remedies and reconciliations that make for good legislation. I would share Mr. Chauvel's view of the committee stages of this bill. It wasn't particularly formative, and that was a disappointment to me. A disappointment, but that's the way we're established in Parliament, so that's the way it went. My view is that with this particular bill, it's rational and it's national. They go together in this serious piece of legislation. Labour has four main concerns about the bill. The functions are not broad enough. The objectives should require the EPA to protect the environment. The EPA should be independent from its minister, and the legislation is not clear about the need for the EPA to take account of Maori perspectives in decision making. There are short answers, in my view, to those concerns. The functions are too narrow for it to provide leadership. They aren't. The objectives are inadequate. They don't expressly require the EPA to protect the environment. It does. The EPA is not sufficiently independent from its minister. It is. And the legislation is not clear about the need for EPA to take into account Maori perspectives in decision making. It does. However, to expand on why I think that, under the proposed structure, the Ministry for the Environment will have responsibility for policy, the EPA responsibility for regulatory functions, and the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment will be the auditor. That's fairly decent, wide sort of structure to provide leadership. Separating the functions will ensure that the environment is properly protected. All the legislation that sits behind the EPA, and let's remember we're just changing the regulator, not the regulations, all the legislation that sits behind it has a protection of the environment at its core. Mr. Speaker, it has no other purpose. It has no other purpose. This is a significant improvement on the status quo of the Ministry for the Environment, which Labor, with some pride, has said that they established, but unfortunately they left it untouched for 9 years, hence the changes now. Like Irma, the EPA will have an independent board and a Maori advisory board at arm's length from the Minister. And I think that gives a certain safeguard that it will take into account Maori perspectives in decision-making. That's what those organisations are established for. Another key feature that gives me great confidence in the structure of this bill, Mr. Speaker, is the way that the relative organisations have packed in, scrummed down, got together to make sure that this thing works. And it has been salutary to them. And we spoke to them at the Select Committee about how they're bringing their organisations together, how they're going to handle the shift. A lot of HR has gone into the work. There's a lot of enthusiasm. The thing they anticipate most is, for the first time since they've been doing their work, there will be collegiate structure to give them added collegiate academic strength in the work that they undertake. Instead of working in isolation, they'll suddenly have a group of colleagues to work with. Mr. Speaker, the Labor Party has the opportunity to get in behind this bill and share in the confidence in the progress that it offers. They should, they could, and that would be good. Thank you.
Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr. Speaker, it's with a little bit of disappointment that I find myself in opposition to this piece of legislation. It's a piece of legislation that, had it been properly considered, had it had a clear plan for protection of the environment, had it had a minister who is actually driving forward with a clear agenda and with some confidence himself as a minister in his role, which should be in protecting the environment, then I would have been very enthusiastic about supporting it, even though it obviously would have been introduced by the National Party. And I think that's what both the Minister and the Chair of the Committee, with due respect, fail to understand, that actually there are times when proposed legislation can be agreed by everyone, and that's an opportunity that it would be wise to take. The obstacle that National has to overcome in order to do that is that they have to find a plan. A plan in anything would be good. A plan for the economy would be fantastic for the government to have. A plan for jobs. Actually, speaking from a local perspective, a plan for heat pumps in Christchurch homes before the middle of winter would be quite handy. And when preparing this legislation, a plan for the environment and its protection would have been really valuable. But National didn't do that. They don't have a plan for anything, and that's why it's with some disappointment that I end up being in a position of opposition to this bill. Labor actually supported this bill at its introduction so that it could go to the Select Committee. And at that time we said we want to hear the debate, we want to see if improvements can be made, because in theory the idea is good. As Chris Ockenvold pointed out, of course it's good to have a strong regulator. Of course it's good to have collegiality, as he's so delicately put it. But actually, without a plan and without legislation that backs up the regulator, we'll just get a bunch of overpaid, frustrated bureaucrats. And I'm not sure that that's what the National Party says it's trying to achieve. I'm sure that the current leader of ACT will have something to say about that, and I really look forward to his contribution during this debate, and in particularly hear the ACT contribution in relation to the SOP from Rahui Katane, which John Boscawen revealed to the House just moments ago that the ACT party were never consulted on. That's gobsmacking, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that the Chair of the Select Committee was amazed to hear that his minister hadn't consulted on that particular provision either. So when this bill was introduced, before it went to the Select Committee, we said we'll support that part, but let's tell the House what our concerns were. Well, one of the biggest ones was exactly that point, that instead of a strong authority with a clear mandate to protect the environment, this body would become an overstaffed bunch of bureaucrats who didn't have a clear mandate, and instead were used by the Minister as an opportunity to fast-track controversial projects. Now, I know that members of the other side will lift their hands up in horror and say, we would never do that. Maurice Williamson actually has more integrity, so he won't be raising his hands up in horror, because he knows that's exactly what the Minister and his Cabinet colleagues wanted to do. They want to fast-track other projects, like they've already fast-tracked the Waterview connection, Mr Speaker. That's what the organisation that is meant to be protecting the environment was used for, to fast-track the Waterview connection. The timeframes for submissions were absurdly short for that process. They deliberately ignored the local community board representation, the voice of the very people who are being affected, squashed by the Minister. Who gives a toss about local people was what the National Party people, and the Auckland City Council even asked for the submission deadline to be extended, and the Minister said, go back to Auckland, we're not interested, even though it was actually an Auckland issue. It was the Waterview connection that was being discussed. Not a single Auckland member of the National Party raised their hands in support of local community voice. They stood back and let the local voice be totally trampled by the Environmental Protection Authority, which was being used by the Minister to fast-track controversial proposals. And in the same way, they have done exactly the same thing in the case of Transmission Gully. They circumvented the Wellington Regional Freshwater Plan using the Environmental Protection Authority as their vehicle, and they're going to try exactly the same thing in relation to the men's prison at Wiri. Now, if anyone says that building a men's prison in a community doesn't have an impact and therefore it doesn't matter if it's fast-tracked, is incorrect. And if it wasn't for this organisation being set up and used to fast-track, local people would be able to have their say. Now, Mr Speaker, some people might say, well, that doesn't sound like an Environmental Protection Authority. That doesn't sound like what this agency should be doing. But it's exactly what it's doing, and it's why Labor has opposed this legislation. Despite the theory of it being great, every bit of practice that the National Party has used it for has been absolutely abhorrent and absolutely opposed to the very name of this organisation, Environmental Protection. We shouldn't be surprised, though. We shouldn't be surprised that the National Party has used this organisation to ride roughshod over the voices of local communities, to totally discard the concerns that have been expressed by people about the negative environmental impacts of certain proposals, and instead National have used this organisation to just bowl ahead and sidetrack all other protections and fast-track controversial projects. We shouldn't be surprised about that. One of the first things that National did when they came into government was to throw out the emission trading scheme and bring in a very watered-down version which added billions of dollars of cost that would be then borne by New Zealand taxpayers who are currently finding it very hard to pay their weekly bills, need to be reminded that the national government loaded bucket loads of costs onto them through changing the responsibility of polluters in the emission trading scheme. So polluters got let off the hook. Nick Smith said, let them pollute, let them not be charged for their pollution. Instead, let ordinary mum and dad taxpayers pay for it. Jerry Brownlee, who used to be the Minister of Energy and Resources, tried opening up Schedule 4 land to mining, and it wasn't until there was a huge outcry up and down the country that finally he changed his mind and backed off it. I'm not sure that he's backed off it completely. He still drools at the idea of having mining up and down our most important parts in New Zealand, but it's another example of where the National Party have completely ignored our New Zealand brand of clean and green, our 100% pure motivation for exports and tourism, and have just said, We've got a quick buck to be made here by people who we know will donate to the National Party if they're able to take advantage